A corrupt politician, drunk on power, issues orders from his high throne, crushing those beneath him without a second thought. He thrives on the suffering of the people, stripping them of their rights, their dignity, and their means to survive, while cozying up to those in his circle, indulging in backroom deals and lavish comforts. His loyalty isn't to the people, but to his own greed, feeding off control while the world below him crumbles. America's relationship with Puerto Rico has been marked by colonial control, exploitation, and ongoing injustices. The island, taken from Spain in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, has since been subjected to numerous oppressive policies that continue to affect its people today. Here are some key historical and ongoing injustices, historical crimes and injustices against Puerto Rico. Forbidding the Puerto Rican flag, the Gag Law, 1948. The U.S. imposed Law 53, also known as La Ley de la Mordeza, the Gag Law, which made it illegal to own or display the Puerto Rican flag, sing patriotic songs, or speak out against U.S. rule. People were jailed for simply possessing a flag. This law was repealed in 1957, but the damage was already done. And let me repeat this to you again just to show you how evil a person can be. Sterilization of Puerto Rican women, 1930s to 1970s. One of the most horrifying acts of control was the mass sterilization campaign. Nearly one-third of Puerto Rican women were sterilized, often without their consent or understanding, as part of a U.S.-sponsored eugenics program. The goal was population control, treating Puerto Ricans as expendable subjects rather than citizens with rights. Land theft and economic exploitation. The U.S. implemented policies that stole farmland and forced Puerto Ricans into extreme poverty. The Foraker Act, 1900, and Jones Act, 1917, ensured U.S. corporations controlled the economy while Puerto Ricans struggled under poverty and lack of self-rule. The Jones Act and second-class citizenship, 1917. Puerto Ricans were given U.S. citizenship in 1917 not to grant them rights but to draft them into World War I. The Jones Act also requires all goods shipped to Puerto Rico to come through U.S. ships, making food and supplies unnecessarily expensive. This law is still in effect today, strangling Puerto Rico's economy. Ongoing injustices and modern exploitation. Lack of voting rights and representation. Puerto Ricans cannot vote for the U.S. president despite being U.S. citizens. They also lack full representation in Congress, meaning they have no voice in the very government that controls them.
Disaster neglect. Hurricane Maria, 2017. After Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, the U.S. response was slow and inadequate. Thousands of Puerto Ricans died due to government neglect. Meanwhile, Trump infamously threw paper towels at victims instead of providing real aid. Corporate takeover and gentrification. Wealthy Americans and investors are buying up land in Puerto Rico, displacing locals while benefiting from tax loopholes. The Act 22 and Act 60 tax incentives allow rich foreigners to move to Puerto Rico without paying taxes, while locals struggle to afford housing. Energy crisis and privatization. After privatizing Puerto Rico's power grid, the island now suffers from frequent blackouts while a private U.S. company, Luma Energy, profits. Meanwhile, Puerto Ricans pay some of the highest electricity rates in the U.S. while still experiencing unreliable service. Criminal neglect of Puerto Rican schools and healthcare. Schools and hospitals in Puerto Rico are underfunded and in crisis. Teachers are underpaid, hospitals lack resources, and many Puerto Ricans are forced to move to the mainland for better healthcare. The U.S. treating Puerto Rico as a colony in 2024. Puerto Rico is still not a state nor an independent nation. The U.S. controls its economy, laws, and political system, treating it like a colony rather than an equal part of the country. Final thoughts. Puerto Rico has been a victim of colonial rule, economic exploitation, and political oppression at the hands of the United States. From banning its flag and sterilizing its women to modern-day gentrification and government neglect, the island continues to fight for justice. The question remains, will Puerto Rico ever be free from U.S. control, or will the exploitation continue? The fight for Puerto Rico's future, resistance and hope. Despite centuries of oppression, Puerto Ricans have never stopped resisting. The spirit of rebellion, resilience, and national pride runs deep in the veins of the island. Here's how Puerto Ricans continue to fight for justice and a better future.
The independence movement, a fight that never died from the times of Pedro Albizu Campos and the Nationalist Party to modern pro-independence movements. Puerto Ricans have demanded self-governance. Even though the U.S. violently suppressed independence leaders, imprisoning, exiling, or even assassinating some, the fight for freedom continues. The Puerto Rican Independence Party, PIP, is still active today, advocating for complete separation from the U.S. Movements like Boricua Libre, Jornada, Se Acabaron las Promesas, and other activist groups are growing in strength, demanding an end to colonial rule. Protests and uprisings, the power of the people. Puerto Ricans have shown time and time again that they will not stay silent in the face of injustice. Some of the biggest protests include, Ricky Renuncia, 2019. The people of Puerto Rico forced the resignation of corrupt Governor Ricardo Rossello after leaked chats revealed government corruption, homophobia, and disrespect towards Hurricane Maria victims. The fight against Luma Energy. Thousands have protested against the privatization of Puerto Rico's power grid, demanding an end to U.S. corporate control. Marches against U.S. exploitation and Act 60. People have been pushing back against the gentrification and economic takeover of the island by wealthy Americans. Puerto Rican diaspora, fighting from the mainland. Millions of Puerto Ricans live in the U.S. mainland due to economic hardship and lack of opportunities on the island. Many of them are activists, using their voices to demand fair treatment for Puerto Rico. Organizations like Boricuas Unidos and La Diaspora and Power for Puerto Rico are leading efforts to change policies that hurt the island. They advocate for the repeal of the Jones Act, which keeps Puerto Rico financially dependent on the U.S. They push for disaster relief accountability, making sure funds reach the people who need them. They support Puerto Rican statehood for independence, demanding an end to second-class citizenship.
The question of statehood versus independence. The future of Puerto Rico remains uncertain. There are three main political viewpoints: statehood. Some Puerto Ricans want to become the 51st state to gain full voting rights, equal federal funding, and economic stability. However, this means completely giving up independence. Independence. Many believe Puerto Rico must break free from U.S. control and become its own nation. But the U.S. will never let go easily, and independence would require economic restructuring. Enhanced Commonwealth. Some prefer a middle ground approach, keeping U.S. ties but gaining more autonomy. However, history has proven that Puerto Rico is treated as a colony under this system. The U.S. government delays any real action on Puerto Rico's status, keeping the island in political limbo while continuing to exploit its people. Puerto Rico's future. What needs to change? For Puerto Rico to truly thrive, these injustices must be addressed. Abolish the Jones Act. This law cripples Puerto Rico's economy and must be repealed. Cancel Puerto Rico's debt. The U.S. has used debt as a tool of control. Much of it is unfair and should be forgiven. Stop U.S. corporate exploitation. Laws like Act 60 should be removed so Puerto Ricans, not rich Americans, can reclaim their land. Recognize Puerto Rico's right to choose. The island's political future should be decided by Puerto Ricans, not U.S. politicians who use the issue for their own gain. Improve education, healthcare and infrastructure. Puerto Rico needs proper funding and local control over these essential services. Final words. Puerto Rico's struggle is not over. Puerto Rico's history is full of pain, oppression, and resilience. The U.S. has treated the island like a colony for over 125 years, extracting wealth while giving little in return. But Puerto Ricans continue to resist, fight, and demand justice. The question remains, will Puerto Rico ever be free? The answer lies in the hands of its people, who have never stopped fighting for their homeland.
Crimes committed by the United States against Puerto Rico and its people. The U.S. has committed countless injustices against Puerto Rico since taking control in 1898. From political oppression to economic exploitation, forced sterilization, and violent suppression, the U.S. government has treated Puerto Ricans as second-class citizens while extracting wealth from the island. Here are some of the most brutal and shameful crimes the U.S. has committed against Puerto Rico. The Ponce Massacre, 1937. U.S. ordered massacre of peaceful protesters on Palm Sunday, March 21, 1937. A group of Puerto Rican nationalists organized a peaceful march in Ponce to demand independence. The U.S. appointed governor, Blanton Winship, ordered the police to open fire on the unarmed crowd. 19 people were killed, including a 7-year-old girl. Over 200 were wounded, many shot in the back while fleeing. The U.S. government never acknowledged its responsibility for this massacre. Forced sterilization of Puerto Rican women, 1930s to 1970s. For decades, the U.S. government used Puerto Rican women as lab rats for population control experiments. Under false pretenses, doctors sterilized nearly 1/3 of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age without their full consent. Many were told the procedure was temporary or necessary for their health. The U.S. saw Puerto Ricans as excess population and wanted to reduce their numbers to maintain economic control. This was one of the largest mass sterilization programs in history, a crime against humanity. Medical experiments and the birth control pill trials, 1950s to 1960s, Puerto Rico became a testing ground for unethical U.S. medical experiments. Without informed consent, women were given high-dose experimental birth control pills, causing severe side effects. Dr. Gregory Pincus and Dr. John Rock conducted clinical trials on poor Puerto Rican women. Many suffered from blood clots, depression, and permanent infertility. The pill was later sold in the U.S. as a safe contraceptive, despite Puerto Rican women suffering the consequences.
The suppression of Puerto Rican nationalism, 1948, Gag Law. The U.S. feared Puerto Rican independence movements, so in 1948, they criminalized the Puerto Rican flag, pro-independence speech, and even singing patriotic songs. Law 53, the Gag Law, made it illegal to express pro-independence beliefs. People were arrested, tortured, and even murdered for advocating for Puerto Rico's freedom. This law was modeled after anti-communist laws and fascist regimes. The U.S. used brutal force to silence leaders like Pedro Albizu Campos, who was tortured with radiation experiments in prison. Operation Bootstrap, 1940s to 1950s, economic colonization. Instead of investing in Puerto Rican industries, the U.S. government launched Operation Bootstrap, a plan that forced Puerto Rico into economic dependence. Puerto Rican farmers were displaced to make room for U.S. corporations. Local industries were destroyed, making Puerto Rico reliant on cheap factory jobs controlled by American businesses. The Jones Act ensured that all imports and exports had to go through the U.S., increasing prices for Puerto Ricans. Puerto Rico became a sweatshop colony, where corporations profited from cheap labor while keeping wages low. Political assassinations and FBI targeting of Puerto Rican leaders. For decades, the FBI worked to eliminate pro-independence leaders in Puerto Rico. Their program, known as COINELPRO, targeted activists, including Filiberto Ojeda Rios, executed by the FBI in 2005. Pedro Albizu Campos, imprisoned and tortured for his role in the independence movement. Lolita Lebron and the Nationalist Party, arrested after attacking the U.S. Capitol in 1954 to bring attention to Puerto Rico's colonial status. Even today, pro-independence activists are labeled as terrorists and monitored by U.S. intelligence agencies. Act 60. The new colonization through gentrification. Puerto Rico is being stolen again, not by the military, but by rich Americans taking over the land. Under Act 60, wealthy foreigners can move to Puerto Rico, avoid paying taxes, and buy land at low prices. Puerto Ricans are being displaced as housing prices skyrocket. Beaches and public spaces are being privatized for millionaires. Local businesses can't compete, as foreign investors get tax breaks. This is modern-day economic colonization, turning Puerto Rico into a playground for the rich, while forcing locals to flee.
Puerto Rico still has no political power, 2024 and beyond. To this day, Puerto Rico remains a U.S. colony, with no voting rights in presidential elections and no real representation in Congress. The U.S. controls Puerto Rico's economy, laws, and government without allowing Puerto Ricans to have a say. Despite multiple referendums, Congress refuses to act on Puerto Rico's status. The island is kept in a state of economic crisis, ensuring dependency on the U.S. Final thoughts. Puerto Rico deserves justice. The crimes committed against Puerto Rico are undeniable. The U.S. has treated Puerto Ricans as disposable labor, test subjects, and colonial subjects for over 125 years. From political suppression to economic theft, medical experiments, and environmental destruction, the abuses continue to this day. Yet, Puerto Ricans have never stopped fighting. The spirit of resistance lives on in the activists, independence movements, and the people who continue to demand justice. Puerto Rico deserves the right to decide its own future, free from U.S. control. Puerto Ricans were not enslaved by the United States in the same way African slaves were brought to North America, but Puerto Rico does have a long history of slavery, first under Spain and later under systems of economic oppression imposed by the U.S. Slavery in Puerto Rico under Spain, 1500s, 1873. When the Spanish colonized Puerto Rico, they enslaved the Taino people, forcing them to work in mines and plantations. After the Taino population was decimated, Spain imported African slaves to work on sugar, coffee, and tobacco plantations. Puerto Rico was one of the last places in the Americas to abolish slavery. Spain officially ended slavery in Puerto Rico in 1873, just 25 years before the U.S. took control. Economic and labor exploitation under U.S. rule, 1898, present, after the U.S. invaded and took control of Puerto Rico in 1898, they created a system of economic enslavement that kept Puerto Ricans in extreme poverty while American corporations made massive profits. How the U.S. enslaved Puerto Rico economically, land seizures and displacement, and the U.S. took over the best farmland and gave it to American sugar corporations, forcing Puerto Ricans to work as low-paid laborers on land they once owned. The Jones Act, 1917. This law made Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens, but only so they could be drafted into World War I. It also trapped Puerto Rico in an economic chokehold, forcing all imports and exports to go through the U.S., raising prices and hurting the local economy.
Yes, in many ways, Puerto Rico was kidnapped in its own land by the United States. While the U.S. never officially called it a kidnapping, the way it took control of Puerto Rico, without giving its people a choice, was an act of colonial domination that stripped Puerto Ricans of their freedom, resources, and self-determination. Yes, this is exactly what's happening. Tourists and foreign investors are coming to Puerto Rico not just to vacation, but to take over the island and displace Puerto Ricans from their own land. This isn't just regular tourism, it's a form of modern colonization disguised as development. How are foreigners taking over Puerto Rico? 1. Act 20 and Act 22, now Act 60, a tax haven for the rich. These laws allow millionaires from the U.S. to move to Puerto Rico and pay no federal or state taxes on capital gains. While they pay nothing, Puerto Ricans continue to pay high taxes on food, gas, electricity, and property. These foreigners do not contribute to the local economy, they just buy up property, driving up prices and pushing Puerto Ricans out of their own neighborhoods. 2. The extreme rise in cost of living in places like San Juan, Dorado, and Rinson. Rent and housing prices have skyrocketed so much that Puerto Ricans can no longer afford to live in their own island. Entire families are being forced out of their homes, while foreign buyers turn properties into luxury rentals and Airbnbs. Many Puerto Ricans are forced to move to the U.S. because they can no longer afford a decent life in their homeland. 3. Mass purchase of land and beaches. Wealthy foreigners are buying up beaches and protected lands to build mansions, hotels, and private resorts. Beaches are public by law, but many have blocked access, preventing Puerto Ricans from enjoying what rightfully belongs to them. In Rinson and Vieques, entire communities have been evicted to build luxury developments for the wealthy. 4. The privatization of everything. The Puerto Rican government has privatized electricity, roads, education, and even healthcare, handing them over to foreign companies that raise prices and lower quality. Example, Luma Energy, the foreign company that controls electricity, has left Puerto Rico with constant blackouts and insanely high rates, all while profiting off the people.
5. Puerto Rico is seen as a playground. To many foreigners, Puerto Rico is not a home, but a cheap place to exploit. They buy properties, enjoy the tax benefits, and when it no longer benefits them, they leave and abandon the economic mess they helped create. They don't care about the culture, history, or the people of the island. They only care about their own gain. 6. What can we do? Educate people on what is really happening. Protect the land, beaches, and natural resources from privatization and exploitation. Support local businesses instead of foreign chains. Demand changes in laws that benefit Puerto Ricans instead of wealthy outsiders. Fight against corruption within the government that keeps selling Puerto Rico to the highest bidder. Puerto Rico is not for sale. What's happening is a second wave of colonialism, where outsiders are displacing Puerto Ricans and slowly taking over the island. Puerto Rico has always resisted, and now is the time to open our eyes and fight for what is ours.
Basta ya. Pa'lante, Boricua. Puerto Rico resiste. El americano coloniador es una persona que se cree que tiene dominio del mundo entero y se cree que puede hacer lo que le da gana y si no, ellos cometen masacres con el que considere ser su enemigo. Es como si quisieran deshacerse de todo el mundo y ellos ser los únicos que reinan. Estamos bregando con el poder satánico hace siglos, y no nos habíamos dado cuenta.